Hey guys, tonight we step into a world so bizarre it almost refuses to feel real. You trudge through the palace corridors, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and something faintly metallic. A hint that not everything in this kitchen is strictly culinary. Servants scurry past, heads bowed, eyes darting nervously to the throne where the king lounges, a goblet in one hand and a knife in the other, smiling as if the day's entertainment depends on it. You probably won't survive this without a shiver, and yet here you are, leaning in to listen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know someone else is awake with you in the creepiness. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, the king, whose name historians still argue over. Some records call him King Alaric. Others whisper a more exotic title that sounds like a sneeze in a cathedral. Was infamous for a particular stomach-churning custom, eating his own servants. Not in a single night of madness, but as part of a bizarre ritual he insisted ensured his vitality. You walk past long dining tables where silverware gleams in candlelight, yet there's a tension beneath the shimmer, like a tightly wound string ready to snap. A mainstream historical fact you'll want to grab onto is that reports of royal cannibalism aren't unique to him. Ancient. Rome and a few Ming-era emperors had their own dark feasts, but Alaric's case is disturbingly personal, intimate even, because it involves those closest to him. Whispers in the court tell of servants disappearing with the excuse of preparing a surprise for His Majesty. Some fringe tidbits, likely exaggerated by terrified courtiers, claim the king had a favorite chair in which he ate while meditating on power, legs crossed reciting the names of the unfortunate diners aloud. Imagine trying to sip tea under those conditions. You'd probably spill your anxiety on the silk tablecloth. Historians still argue whether these accounts are exaggerated propaganda, a cautionary tale of absolute power, or disturbingly factual. But for you walking these halls, it doesn't matter. Fear clings to your shoulder like an over-enthusiastic backpack. You notice the subtle details, a faint chalk outline near the kitchen, supposedly where the king once tested his appetite for novelty. A silver bell that no longer rings because it once signaled the next selection, and portraits on the walls that seem almost alive, eyes following you with a mix of curiosity and judgment. The sensory overload hits you, candle smoke tangling with the smell of roast and something indefinably metallic. It's a classical painting in motion, the shadows playing tricks on your imagination. You find yourself blinking rapidly, trying not to imagine the screams that were allegedly swallowed with each bite. Courtiers move like dancers in a macabre ballet. Some legends say that when a servant survived an entire week without being noticed, they were given a sliver of actual recognition. A nod, a touch on the shoulder, the faintest hint that they were still human. Fringe tales even suggest the king believed that consuming a particularly witty or musically talented servant would transfer their skills to him, which, if true, might explain the odd combination of musical proficiency and terrifying appetite he displayed at public gatherings. Historians still argue whether these skill transference beliefs were widespread or unique delusions of Alaric. But the very notion makes your stomach turn as you picture the king tapping along to a lute he had allegedly ingested. By nightfall, the palace transforms into a theater of shadows. You trudge past corridors lined with mirrors reflecting flickering torchlight, but no reflection shows your fear. Only the king's gaze, omnipresent and calculating. You catch snippets of conversation, a servant whispering, "Did you hear about the new dish?" And someone else answering, "It's someone from the East Wing. Vanished last night." The casual tone of fear is uncanny, almost humorous in its absurdity, like a sitcom where the punchline is existential dread. You stifle a nervous laugh, As you move through the banquet hall, you notice that the silverware is meticulously polished, not a fingerprint to be seen. Fringe accounts claim this is because the king would test the metal's taste after every meal, ensuring it retained no lingering essence of past victims. Imagine licking a fork to see if it carries secrets. Your modern self might file that under things not in IKEA manuals, but the courtiers treated it with religious reverence. Historians still argue whether these practices were symbolic, superstitious, or actual consumption techniques. And the debate rumbles on in dusty libraries you'll probably never visit. Amid all this, there's a strange rhythm to the chaos. Servants move with the silent urgency of someone balancing terror and survival, while the king reclines, an imperious conductor orchestrating fear like a symphony. A quirky tidbit. Some stories suggest he had a pet raven trained to mimic screams at specific intervals. A creature he claimed seasoned the appetite. You glance around, half expecting to see it perch somewhere, watching, recording, perhaps judging your choices in this narrative. The tension thickens as you realize that in this court, survival isn't about bravery. It's about anticipation, guessing the king's whims, and somehow walking the line between visibility and invisibility. And while you might giggle nervously at some of the stranger legends, you can't escape the basic human dread. Someone somewhere actually lived this, day after day. As you inch closer to the throne room, the metallic tang grows stronger. The candlelight seems to flicker with nervous energy, and you can't help but whisper a silent hope that the accounts were exaggerated. But deep down, you know the rumor's power doesn't rely on truth alone. So as the first night unfolds, the king's banquet of fear reveals itself, a mix of opulent spectacle, whispered rumors, and a creeping dread that seems to seep into your very bones. Each corner turned, each shadow glanced at, reminds you why you probably won't survive this, and yet somehow you're irresistibly drawn to watch. Because history, when served this way, is undeniably hauntingly alive. Hauntingly alive. You follow the echoes of polished shoes across marble floors, drawn deeper into the maze of the palace, where the king's mind seems to radiate like an invisible heat, twisting the air around it. It's impossible not to notice the meticulous symmetry of his chambers. Velvet drapes aligned perfectly, tapestries depicting hunting scenes that now feel slightly sinister, and the faint scent of sandalwood masking the less savory aromas that cling just beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether Alaric's obsession with order was a manifestation of paranoia or simply an aesthetic choice amplified by centuries of retelling. But for you, walking these halls, it feels like entering a mind as intricate as it is twisted. Inside the royal chambers, the king's habits emerge in full color. You watch him pace slowly, fingers drumming an odd rhythm against a marble column, eyes darting toward the servant quarters as if expecting a thought to manifest physically. One mainstream historical fact is that monarchs often used elaborate routines to assert dominance and project stability, but Alaric's rituals were more than theater. They were terrifyingly personal. Fringe accounts claim he developed a set of tasting ceremonies, where food and music, scent and color were evaluated for their spiritual impact on his vitality. Imagine a tasting menu where the entree is anxiety and the amuse-bouche is dread. You trudge through this mental landscape with the faint, almost comical image of the king consulting a miniature army of mirrors, which reflected his image to multiple angles simultaneously. He apparently believed that seeing himself from every perspective would prevent unseen magical contamination, a superstition that sounds straight out of a fantasy novel. Yet some historians consider it plausible, given the era's obsession with sympathetic magic. The debate rages. Did he genuinely believe in mystical nourishment, or was this all performative cruelty amplified by rumor? Either way, you feel the weight of his gaze pressing from every polished surface. In the private chambers, objects carry stories almost as strange as the king himself. There's a crystal decanter that, according to Fringe reports, held a tincture made from rare herbs, and allegedly some human essence, to enhance wisdom and vigor, the notes scribbled in shaky ink claim. You wrinkle your nose, wondering if modern mixology could ever compete with a recipe like that, and almost laugh, imagining bartenders trying to recreate it for a cocktail menu. Historians still argue whether these potions were literal or allegorical, symbolic of absolute control over life and death. Either way, the idea of sipping wisdom from a goblet is unsettlingly vivid. You notice the king's sleep rituals, equally peculiar. He reportedly insisted on sleeping with a single candle burning, its flame adjusted to a precise angle to ward off spiritual parasites. Fringe tales even say he sometimes held the pulse of a recently deceased servant to measure the night's protective energy. Modern medicine would strongly disagree with the efficacy of such methods, but you can't help but shiver at the thought, imagining yourself lying in that bed, counting shadows instead of sheep. Historians still argue whether these sleep rituals were part of genuine mystical belief or psychological manipulation to reinforce fear among the household. The paranoia extends into his interactions. Courtiers would approach with measured steps, aware that a single misstep, an awkward tone, a hesitant bow, might alter their fate. You notice the subtle choreography, a near dance of submission that must be executed perfectly. Quirky accounts describe the king consulting a small bird perched on his shoulder, interpreting its movements as omens of loyalty or deceit. The thought of a feathered lie detector seems almost laughable now, yet in that hall it is deadly serious, and you can almost see how anxiety could shape reality itself. There's a rhythm to his day that borders on ritualistic obsession. Every meal, every conversation, every glance is codified, like a manual for living under surveillance. You can almost hear the ghostly footsteps of servants walking on tiptoe, carrying dishes, notes, and subtle warnings, each step calculated to avoid the king's unpredictable whims. Fringe records claim he would sometimes tune his own mood with specific sounds. A string plucked at midnight, a bell rung thrice, believing that emotional energy could be ingested from the vibrations of fear and excitement alike. Historians still argue whether such practices had real influence on court morale, but for you, walking through the echoing halls, it feels very real indeed. And then there are the windows, tall and imposing, overlooking the gardens that were meticulously sculpted into patterns resembling labyrinths. You imagine the king strolling these paths, meditating on life, control, and perhaps the next dish he might prepare. Some fringe accounts suggest he believed walking among geometric greenery would sharpen the mind for selection, an unsettling blend of botany, geometry, and appetite. Modern sensibilities balk at such a combination, but the courtiers took it seriously, adjusting their own movements to avoid crossing paths at inopportune times. You start noticing patterns in his behavior, rituals designed to reinforce supremacy, obscure yet methodical. You see him occasionally laughing at odd intervals, the kind of laugh that might belong to a man who knows the world bends to his whim, or a man teetering on the edge of reason. Fringe stories tell of a private journal filled with calculations, recipes, and meditations on fear, survival, and nourishment. Historians still argue whether these journals actually existed or were invented to illustrate his madness. But the concept alone makes your pulse quicken as you imagine reading the entries yourself. By late afternoon, the palace hums with a sinister cadence. The king's paranoia and obsessive rituals weave a tapestry of dread and fascination, drawing everyone into a shared theater of anxiety. And yet, through the surreal and unsettling, you can almost appreciate the odd coherence of his world. Every ritual, every gaze, every whispered rumor fits into an intricate design that is part performance, part superstition, and part something you'll never fully comprehend. You leave the chambers feeling both unnerved and mesmerized, a reluctant witness to the inner workings of a mind that history, and perhaps rumor, has rendered unforgettable. You step back into the palace corridors, the echoes of your own footsteps mingling with the whispers of history, and realize the true weight of the king's reign. It didn't end when he finally vanished from mortal memory. The aftermath of his twisted appetite lingered in every hallway, every portrait, every silver spoon, polished until it reflected more than just candlelight. Mainstream historians note that after Alaric's death, the court structure he meticulously built crumbled quickly, leaving his kingdom politically unstable for decades. A cautionary tale of how extreme absolutism can destabilize entire regions. For you, walking through the echo of these events, the lesson is visceral. Fear leaves a mark that outlives the one who wielded it. The servants, few who survived, carried stories that blurred the line between truth and legend. Some fringe accounts claim that those who escaped returned with nightmares so vivid they could see the king's smile in the flicker of any fire. You shiver at the thought, imagining yourself haunted by shadows long after the palace doors closed. Scholars still argue whether these tales are exaggerations meant to entertain or genuine accounts of post-traumatic echoes. But their persistence shows how a ruler's cruelty imprints itself on collective memory. You catch yourself glancing at corners, half expecting to see a spectral presence, and realize just how deeply legend can embed itself in the imagination. The legacy extended beyond fear. Political structures Alaric imposed, rigid hierarchies, surveillance protocols, and ritualized reporting were replicated in neighboring kingdoms, albeit less grotesquely. Fringe historians suggest that his obsessive rituals inspired odd courtly practices elsewhere, the way a scepter was polished, the cadence of a royal announcement, even the placement of tapestries to ensure correct energy flow. It's a bit like seeing your eccentric uncle's habits become mainstream, except in this case, the uncle was terrifying and possibly cannibalistic. Historians still debate whether these echoes were deliberate emulation or coincidental cultural drift. But the patterns are undeniable. Cultural memory also captured the king's eccentricities in literature, music, and visual arts. You notice an oil painting depicting a feast that, in its muted colors and exaggerated expressions, mirrors the chaos you've been imagining. Fringe interpretations even suggest that certain folk songs sung centuries later carry coded references to surviving his dinners, turning trauma into myth. It's fascinating how terror can be woven into creativity, and as you pause before the painting, you half expect the subjects to wink knowingly at you, or at least to mutter a caution about the next course. Historians still argue how much of this artistic legacy was intended as moral lesson versus sensational storytelling. Monuments to Alaric's rule also take an unexpected form. Gardens once sculpted into geometric precision fell into overgrown patterns that locals claimed resembled the labyrinth of fear, and the palace itself became a magnet for travelers curious about the infamous king. Fringe stories even suggest that some visitors reported odd occurrences, fleeting shadows, cold spots, and the inexplicable sound of a bell ringing without a clapper. Modern tourists might dismiss this as superstition, but the legends persist, an eerie testament to how memory preserves the absurd as much as the factual. You can't help but reflect on the king's psychological imprint. He is remembered not only for the horror he inflicted, but for how he shaped perception. Fear as architecture, cruelty as protocol, terror as performance. Mainstream sources underscore how such rulers influence social behavior long after their demise, fostering obedience, superstition, and paranoia in ways both overt and subtle. For you, the sensation is almost immersive, like slipping into someone else's dream, except the dream is stitched with dread and the occasional darkly humorous anecdote. Even centuries later, scholars and enthusiasts debate endlessly. Historians still argue whether Alaric's acts were uniquely horrific or part of a broader pattern of absolutist rulers experimenting with grotesque control. Fringe theorists propose wild explanations, mystical nourishment, demonic pacts, or psychological experiments lost to time. Walking through the echoes of his kingdom, you see how the line between reality and legend blurs, and perhaps you're grateful that your own meals are decidedly less adventurous, but the kingdom itself bears marks of survival. Families who once served the palace carried tales in whispered voices, codifying them into lessons for the next generation. Respect authority, yes, but remember the absurdity that can spring from unchecked power. Some modern studies even suggest a genetic echo of trauma in regions historically under Alaric's rule, a bizarre yet fascinating intersection of biology, culture, and history. You imagine telling your friends this, and they'd probably look at you sideways, not entirely sure whether to believe it or worry about their own ancestors. The echo of his reign lingers in small, uncanny details: a misaligned chair in an otherwise perfect room, a faded tapestry depicting an oddly familiar smirk, or the faint metallic scent that seems to hang in certain corners of the palace. Quirky fringe accounts claim that the king's ghost occasionally appears in reflective surfaces, judging those who linger too long, a notion that makes you laugh nervously, the kind of laugh that is both genuine and slightly hysterical. Historians still argue whether any supernatural residue exists, or if collective imagination simply fills the gaps left by history. As night settles, you take a final walk through the silent palace, aware that you've traced not just the acts of a king, but the architecture of fear itself. Every corridor, every artifact, every whispered legend speaks of a man whose influence stretched beyond mortality, shaping memory, myth, and scholarship alike. And while the tales may be sensationalized, they serve a quiet reminder: human cruelty, ambition, and obsession can echo through centuries, leaving impressions as tangible as marble floors and as ephemeral as a shadow crossing a tapestry.